The army of Judah was paralyzed by fear when they heard a mighty multitude was quickly drawing near. But as they prayed for deliverance, the victory would begin. For when we call upon the Lord, we summon all of heaven. Pray on, for you are who the Lord is looking for. Pray on, for this will tear those mighty strongholds down. Stay on your knees, for this is where the battle is won. Very soon you'll win the victory. Pray on. When Daniel faced the lions for worshiping the Lord, it seemed there was no hope at all for what would be in store. But when we stand on holy ground, our smallest prayer is heard. Instead of on our circumstance, our eyes are on the Lord. Pray on, for you are who the Lord is looking for. Pray on, for this will tear those mighty strongholds down. Stay on your knees, for this is where the battle is won. Very soon you'll win the victory. Pray on. When your questions go unanswered and your prayers may seem in vain, they don't seem to make a difference. They don't seem to make a change. Just rest assured God knows your needs and He hears each time you pray. Your prayers are reaching heaven and the answer's on the way. Pray on, for you are who the Lord is looking for. Pray on, or this will tear those mighty strongholds down. Stay on your knees, for this is where the battle is won. There's no better place for you to be than seeking the Father prayerfully, and very soon you'll win a victory. Pray on.
I, I'd like to thank Priscilla for that beautiful, beautiful selection. That was wonderful. So thank you very much. Um, I am grateful to be here with you today. When Benji called and asked me if I would do it, it was one of those kind of automatic yeses. I mean, without thought. He and Abby are two of my favorite folks, and just a chance to share with their church and with them during this time period is just one of those things that I look forward to. Um, this morning during the Sabbath school lesson, which I was reflecting on, which where we were talking about the rebirth of planet Earth. And when we talk about where Earth is headed in the future, there's a new heaven and new Earth, and all the things that we were worried about here will be taken away, and there's no COVID to worry about, and other things to worry about. I look forward to that day. But until then, we have to figure out how to learn to live here on planet Earth with the challenges that have come before us, and the things that we're facing, and the things that we're dealing with. And so part of what I'd like to do today is to just spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about COVID, a little bit about where we are, and to talk a little bit about how to survive it, and kind of how to think through some of where we are. So as I'm starting out, why don't we just start off with a word of prayer? Dearest gracious Heavenly Father, I am so grateful for this chance to be here with you. I thank you for this opportunity to share with your people the word of the Lord. Lord, continue to bleed with us. Please lead us, guide us, direct us. In your precious name we pray. Amen. Excuse me, just one second. Sorry about that. So as we think about COVID, COVID really started about a year ago, about a year and a half ago now. And so, for many of us, when we think about the idea of what COVID has done, especially for people of faith, those of us who are in church every Sabbath, we recognize what we've actually lost and the stressors that we're dealing with. I was telling someone the other day that I have not actually been in a church but twice in the past year. And those two times were both for funerals, which is an unfortunate place to be. That's kind of the place in which we live. It creates a degree of anxiety, a degree of stress, a degree of, is this how we're supposed to live life? Is this how we're supposed to think through things? So part of what I want to do today is just to spend a little time talking about coping mechanisms for figuring out how to deal with things, but also to spend some time answering questions. And so what I want to do is to spend kind of our first half of this conversation, probably about 20, 25 minutes or so, talking about some background. But then I'd like to turn this into a conversation, if that's okay with you, because I find that oftentimes it's that conversation that allows us to really to really share and get more across. So beginning about December of 2019, we saw the COVID virus coming out of China, first cases diagnosed in the United States. And for the first several months, there was this lack of clarity in terms of what we should do. And in fact, in the hospital in which I work, the conversation was you shouldn't wear a mask because it will scare people. It's not really that bad. It may be kind of like the flu, but it's going to go away. Within another month, what we began to see was, oh, this is really serious. You should wear a mask everywhere while you're in the hospital. Then 2 weeks after that, they decided anybody that's non-essential, that's not a doctor, nurse, or other healthcare professional, should be out of the university and out of the healthcare system because it's too dangerous to be here. And that's where we've been since then. Now, the reason I bring that up is it's the lack of certainty that we've gone through during this time period, the inability to really think about what is happening because there's not really a clear sense of what COVID is or what it could do. And so that anxiety in and of itself has created problems, especially as we go along with depression and especially anxiety, because it leaves us in a place of not knowing what are we supposed to do with the situation with which we're dealing. Do we go to the left or do we go to the right? That impact has had a huge burden on families in the sense of what do we now do in our families? What do we now do in our churches? How do we engage and interact with other individuals? And just how do we talk and think about things? So I want to talk a little bit about depression and what it is. So if we think about depression, I kind of break it into mild, moderate, and severe. So there's very mild depression, which is what we generally kind of think of as being down. So when you're feeling down, it's there for a few days, maybe a week or so, but it gets better. There's usually a trigger that's causing it to be a problem. Um, then we think of more moderate depression. Moderate depression is where we begin to see um, more I'm not able to focus. I'm not able to think about things. The depressive symptoms are there more frequently. I'm not quite sure what to do with some of this. And then we talk about more severe depression, where one is thinking about harming themselves. And as we look at what the symptoms of depression are, sometimes it's depressed mood, but sometimes it comes across as anger, as frustration, as I just don't want to be here. I'm not interested in what's going on here anymore. So the mood could look like it's all over the place, which is part of the difficulty in identifying what to do or when somebody is feeling depressed, because it may not always look like depression. So how do we think about dealing with that? The first one is, we know as Adventists especially that a healthy lifestyle, a healthy diet, getting enough sleep, exercising, avoiding alcohol and drugs, those are the kinds of things that we should be doing. However, one of the things that I was looking at recently in my job is the level of substance abuse that's actually gone up among Christians in the United States. Sometimes we don't want to talk about it. And having been, in the church most of my life, is the number of unhealthy behaviors that many of us have that we don't want to talk about. The fact that we may not be sleeping well, we may have more caffeine intake than we would like to admit. We may have a drink or two more than we would like to admit to others. In fact, we probably wouldn't want to admit to others that we're having the drink at all. However, if you look at the data, um, it suggests that even within churches, you're seeing an increase in alcohol use over what would have occurred in the past. Now, exercise regularly. Now, when we think about having healthy relationships, especially around depression and anxiety, how do we get into, an exercise routine? Do we take time to have walks with our families? Do we find times to get out in the yard and play? Do we find ourselves going to a park? In the past, this has been difficult to do because we weren't quite sure whether it was healthy or not. However, based on the data that we have now, which is actually pretty good, the ability to go out to a park, especially with a family who's living in the same house together, to play some games, to walk together, to do things that are just kind of fun, would be a safe, healthy, balanced way of doing things. Thinking about the meals that we eat, COVID has actually caused significant challenges in our lives. Um, I'm talking to the choir here, but I'm also talking to myself, because during COVID, one of the things I've noticed is that I've not exercised as much as I should have done. I've not eaten as healthy as I should, and as a result, I've noticed that I've had some weight gain during this time period, as many of us had. In fact, we often joke in the office about gaining the COVID-19, the 19 pounds that occurred during the COVID time period. And so finding ways, especially as Christians, especially having the health message, to be able to really live that kind of lifestyle, so that we can not only do it for ourselves, but we can share it with others. Making time to unwind. How do we find time to relax? What are the things that we enjoy doing? For everyone, that thing may be different. But finding a time to do those things that you would find to be beneficial for you. Being able to connect with other people. Um, I found that social media has really become a big thing during this time period. The number of friends that I've reconnected with on Facebook, but also the ability to connect on Zoom. I think about even the times we're spending here together today, gives us a chance to connect in ways that we may not have otherwise connected. If you were in North Carolina and I'm here in South Carolina, we're 3 hours from each other. Zoom has allowed us to really be able to connect in ways that we wouldn't have otherwise. One of the things that I've tried to do with my own family is we have a weekly Zoom call to be able to connect with family members that I'm not seeing during COVID, especially before we were all vaccinated. But then also thinking about how do we connect with our faith community? How do we begin to, as churches, find ways to really come together? The fact that there are so many of you on the call today says a lot about your connectivity and your ability to come together, especially for a program like this. But I'd like you to think for a second, are there people that are missing that you haven't talked to? Are there people that may normally be in the number that's not quite here? Is there a new member that's come into your faith community in the past year that you may not have connected with? I frequently talk to churches about the ability to welcome strangers because oftentimes, especially during churches, times like this, and in the ability like to where welcome oftentimes there's a certain degree of moving in and out oftentimes, especially during churches, times like being there for education, the ability to where universities being there because of the military, are those folks really fully integrated either pre-COVID, during COVID, or how will we connect with those folks after COVID? Do we pull them into our communities in a way where they feel welcome? I was talking to a friend day before yesterday, in fact, as we were just kind of chatting about some other things. And this is a person that I've known for a very long time that had moved to a new city February of last year, right before COVID. And one of the things that he was lamenting was the fact that he hadn't had a chance to really connect with any other Christians and any other Adventists in his area because as soon as he moved, things shut down. But then that led to even a deeper conversation around having made a number of moves in the course of my life and thinking about the churches that I've gone to that have been welcoming and open versus the ones that I've been to that have been less so. And in most of those cases, the ones that I went to that were less welcoming, I don't think it was intentionally less welcoming. I think it was the fact that we were set in, or they were set in, the way of doing things. I'm used to having Sabbath dinner with the same group of friends. I'm used to having Sabbath dinner with my family. I'm used to having Sabbath dinner with these group of people in the way that it's always been done. And we may not have the openness for others. But how do we welcome strangers that are coming into our midst? And how do we begin to think about engaging folks, especially during COVID, when our church services may not be the way that they would have been even prior to that time? One of the things that I've noticed is the number of folks that are struggling to cope in lots of ways. As Benji was introducing me, I am an adult psychiatrist, but I'm also a child psychiatrist. As I look at a lot of the kids that I see and I continue to see during this time period, one of the things that I've noticed is the sense of feeling lost in everything that's going on, a sense of finding my place, a sense of figuring out how do I cope, how do I focus, how do I deal with the things that are going on in life. Oftentimes as parents and loved ones and friends, this can be a difficult thing to deal with on a number of levels. First is being able to recognize what's going on, to recognize when a young person is struggling. It may not come across as I'm depressed. Again, it may come across as I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I don't know what to do. It may come across as doing poorly in school. It may come across as disinterest. So one of the things I'd like for you to take away from this as we talk today is the ability to recognize the struggle that exists and how COVID can throw even the best of us off. One of the things that I talk a lot to groups about is the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. And as we look at 1 Kings chapter 18 and 19, it's two of my favorite areas in Scripture, two of my favorite chapters in Scripture. In the first chapter, you see Elijah as a very confident prophet, a man going forth and doing the will of God. He's there. He's so in contact with God that he's able to tell the prophets of Baal, you go ahead, you make your sacrifice. I'm going to let you go first, and let's see what your God has. He then sets them aside and he calls on his God. And his God, he wants to put him to the test. And so he not just puts the sacrifice there, but he doesn't use fire. He wets the sacrifice, and fire comes down from heaven. And we know the story. It consumes everything that's there, including the water around it. But then as we move a couple of verses later into 19, what we begin to see is Elijah becoming scared and anxious. So, what took Elijah from a place of being a confident man of God, whom there was no question that God spoke to being in a place where he's now afraid because Jezebel has told him that she is going to kill him? Now, while the Bible doesn't say specifically, there's a little bit I'm going to tell you about what I've learned about the human mind. It's often the way that we process information and how we let that information in our heads. So the principle is, I hear something. I have a decision to make of how I process what that thing I heard meant. So, for example, if I'm having a conversation with my wife and I say, honey, I don't like the way that dress looks, my wife may take it one of several ways. She may take it as, my husband really wants me to look great when I walk out of the house. And he is absolutely going to want me to wear something that is going to represent me in the best possible light. Or she may interpret it as, gee, obviously he's not very attracted to me anymore and he's just putting me down. That's then going to drive us into a set of behaviors and the way that we're going to think about how to process what's going on. If on one hand, she's hearing, gee, he just wants me to look great, she's probably going to go pull out another dress and say, does this one make me look better? And should I wear this instead of that? That's going to lead us down one path. On the other hand, if she thinks that I don't care about her and that I'm doing this to hurt her, then obviously we're going to have a different reaction, which is probably going to be either I'm incredibly upset, and so I'm going to be angry, or I'm going to be hurt, which is then going to lead us to a set of behaviors. That behavior may be, I'm going to go change, I'm going to look great, we're going to walk out, we're going to have a great time. Or on the other hand, I'm going to go in the room, close the door, and tell you never to speak to me again until I'm just tired of being angry at you. Now, I bring that up because during COVID and during stressful periods of our lives, especially in relationships, one of the things that we know is that we don't always process information the way that we would otherwise. So think for a second, if you're sitting in a room and you're totally relaxed and your kid comes in to tell you something that frustrates you, you're probably going to think, oh, this is a kid. I've told him this a million times in the past. I'll tell him again because my job as a parent is to help them through things. But think about if you're dealing with a day where you're already frustrated. Work has been challenging. Finances are tough. community's not going well. There's pressures from church of things I need to get done. The response to that particular situation may be totally different, which then has an impact on the young person that's now hearing that statement. It could have long term consequences, it can have short term consequences. And I bring that up because one of the jobs I had in my past life was to teach the youth Sabbath school class. And I've remained Facebook friends and friends with a number of those young people as they have grown up. And what I've noticed is many of them stopped coming to church. And so I've had some conversations of, what's the thing that's made you stop coming? And a lot of it has been the way that people talk to me, the conversations that we did or didn't have. Now, bring that up because during COVID, we're all very stressed. We're anxious, many times, rightfully so, based on the things that are going on. And many of us are depressed. And so the question becomes, how do we manage that depression, manage that anxiety in the context of our children, in the context of our friends, in the context of our other church members who are just trying to survive and be in community with us? And so I'm just encouraging you when you're feeling frustrated, when you're feeling upset, to just take a minute to step back and say, how well am I handling this? And how will my actions affect the person that's standing across from me or on the other end of the phone, on the other end of the Zoom, or in the other room that I'm yelling at? How will my actions affect them? And what can I do? We're all stressed because if we just think about what's happened, we talked about the financial issues before. We talked about the job loss. We talked about the fact that many of you may be working from home. Kids, till recently, or some still may be out of school, and so everybody's kind of in the same space all the time, and trying to figure out how do we manage our way when we're in that space, in that same place, in that time together. What do we do with that? One of the things, again, I talk about is praying, learn to relax, getting outside, taking a walk, being able to engage in very different ways, but also being able to remain as part of a community. One of the things I loved about Christ when he was on earth is the fact that I do not recall him ever sending anyone out alone. Even when he sent his disciples out, he sent them out in pairs. And part of that is we are there to help each other up. We're going to all struggle. We're going to all stumble. But the biggest thing is, can we have someone who is our friend, who is our fellow traveler in life, who can really help to pick us up and help to take us to a new place that allows us to be able to share and engage and think about things in a different way? Can they help me figure out how do we host the stranger, the person that comes to our gate that may just need some hospitality to make it through the day? How do we continue to have a life that honors God, to continue to have a vision about who we are as individuals, as families, that will allow us to continue to move forward and to move forth with where we're headed in life? COVID is a point in time. COVID's going to go away. Um, every virus that we know in history is going to end at some point in time. If we look at the numbers, in fact, the COVID numbers are actually getting a little bit better. We're at a bit of a plateau right now, and they may be going up a little bit. But as COVID goes away, how will it reshape us as individuals, but how will it also reshape us as Christians? Will it make us better or will it make us worse? Will we be more likely to reach out to the stranger? Will we be more likely to be the disciples and the evangelists that Jesus wants us to be? Or will we retreat because of the traumatized condition in which we live? In many ways, I think COVID has presented an opportunity for us, an opportunity especially as Christians, because as I look at churches, I've seen two different directions that they have taken. As I look at families, I see different directions that they've taken. On one hand, some have thrived, some have done extremely well. In fact, I was having a conversation yesterday with a pastor that said, our membership is actually up. Our tithe base is up. We are actually doing well. We've figured out how to have small groups, even during the time of COVID. We've figured out how to take care of each other, even during the time of COVID. We've even been able to figure out how to keep some of our youth groups going during the time of COVID. On the other hand, I see other churches that have struggled, that have really had difficulty finding their way and figuring out where they're going, especially in regards to relationship. Because again, relationship is largely what Jesus came for. He came to give us life and life more abundantly. That abundant life, most places I've seen in the scripture, has all been in relationship to other people. So as I kind of close these comments today and really move into really talking more and answering some questions, I just really want to continue to encourage you to, one, look out for each other, because many of us are struggling and we need our community. Look out for strangers because many are moving and have moved during this time period. Many of us have had losses during this time period, whether it's related to a job, whether it's related to a family member, whether it's been related to our own health. The number of losses in terms of death and jobs, etc., has been tremendous. So how do we look out for those who are among us who are suffering? But then the third piece is, how do we keep our faith? So again, I go back to Elijah. And I think about Elijah sitting beside the brook. God came and ministered to Elijah. God continues to minister to us in all kinds of ways. The challenge becomes is, do we recognize when God is there? Do we allow God to help to revive us, even during these time periods, the challenges in which we live? And so I encourage you to just keep pushing forward, to keep pushing on, even during this time of COVID, because it's going to get better. And we just want to be better on the other side of it. And so what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is to open the line for questions and conversation.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. Yeah, thank you for that powerful and edifying and relevant message. I don't know about you, but I have been blessed tremendously. So thank you for allowing the Holy Spirit to use you to glorify his name. Now he has opened the floor for questions, comments, and anything that you feel free. If you have any question for Dr. Rogers, please. Hello, can you hear me? The floor is open for questions and comments. Okay, let me break the silence. Dr. Rogers, Christians who are depressed, should they seek professional help in addition
Okay, let me
to
break the
prayers
silence. Dr. Rogers,
or relying on prayers is enough? What do you think? Christians who are depressed,
You know,
should they seek professional help
that
in
is a
addition?
really good question. I always tell people that if I broke my leg, I'm probably going to go to the emergency room and get checked out. If my blood pressure's up, I'm probably going to go to the doc and get some blood pressure medicine. It gets back to that conversation I was having earlier about the mild, moderate, and severe. Every time that you're feeling depressed doesn't mean that you have to go see a doctor or a counselor or a therapist. Um, Many times it's having a close friend, somebody you can talk to, somebody who's there to help us through the difficult times. I think about situations like, David and Jonathan, for example, where there were times when David was extremely down, he was fearing for his life. He even talked about how depressed he was if you read the Psalms. But his friend Jonathan and the Lord got him through it. Now, that's mild to moderate kind of stuff that's going on there. As we think about the more moderate to severe, where I'm having a thought of hurting myself, this has been going on for 6 months, a year. I don't think it's getting better. I still feel down. I still cry. I still feel, like life is not getting any better. In those cases, I think it's really important to go and see somebody, to talk about what's going on, to be able to deal with the issues that are happening in life. So I think the question is a great one. Sometimes I think that you can handle things at home with friends. Other times you may need to seek more professional help.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions, please? We have time for questions. I know you have a lot of questions. Don't be bashful about asking them, please.
Yeah, I have a question. So,
thank you.
If you are, we'll just say, this is relating to marriage, right? So, if there were an issue where someone had a marital issue and they could not work it out at their home or whatever the case might be, and usually sometimes they don't know what it is, but they know they have an issue. How do you get to the crux of that? Because sometimes in our minds, we might think that a husband and a wife can deal with an issue of a spouse, but how do you know when it's time to seek counseling?
That is a very excellent question. So my wife and I have been married. We just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary last month, in fact. And it was interesting because many times in our marriage, we found ourselves, especially early on, trying to figure out, what's going on here. One of the things that I share with folks all the time is there's a push toward therapy, and I am a big believer in therapy. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a great idea. But there's also the other end of what I call the over pathologizing of things. And so, do you need to make everything into a therapeutic environment? One of the things that we know from the Bible is one, the idea of counsel and having people that you trust that you can counsel with, get advice from, etc. And I think about the number of wise couples, and I can think of two in particular that have come alongside of us through the years and said, you know what, I'm not trying to get in your business, but I can help you through some of this stuff. And we were able to have conversations, work through things, and figure a lot of stuff out that we may not have otherwise figured out on our own. On the other hand, there have been other situations where in one situation, my wife and I did decide to go see a counselor. It wasn't that our marriage was falling apart or anything. We just wanted a neutral third party that wasn't locked into what we were doing, to talk to us. And we found it extremely helpful. It was a person who was a Bible believing Christian, but was also a very, very good counselor. And it really helped to transform how we talk about things, how we look at things, and how we process things. And so I think if I were, looking at it, I might think about it in kind of a graduated way. If there were folks around, couples, parents, other, folks that have done it for a while, sometimes I try to have those conversations if I felt like there was a place where I could build that kind of trust. Um, but once it got beyond that, I wouldn't, hesitate to seek counseling from an outside therapist.
Um, my Dr. Rogers, I think I don't know if you were in my house yesterday, but when you were talking, you gave a scenario that was almost exactly something I experienced yesterday. Yesterday I had an outburst with my one of my daughters, and I think I was throughout the day I was already frustrated, and so when that happened, I mean, I had told her something, hey, don't do this, and that wasn't the first time. I probably said it 1,000 times already. And yesterday when she did it again, I there was an outburst, and I told her, hey, the way I handled it was bad. And so when you talked about the short-term effect that we may have on our kids if we have an outburst, or we in the way we react, is there a way after that reaction where we can what something we can do to mitigate the damage, if any, to the kids, so that if it's a long term or short term you know problem, we can kind of help reduce it.
I think that, a one time I'm angry at my kid kind of thing is not going to, damage the child for life. Um, Kids are very resilient creatures. What we don't want to do is get ourselves in a pattern. And that pattern is very easy to fall into, especially if we're stressed and exposed to stress over a long period of time. I always encourage folks, even with relatively young kids, to point out when we handle things badly and when we don't. If there are times when we don't handle things well, we can admit to our kids, I probably could have said that in a different way, because it teaches us, I think, a very, very valuable lesson. And that is, how do I now handle that situation when I am faced with it as an adult? I always talk to folks and tell them, you know what? One day you're in the prime of life now. That kid that you are having a relationship with, either positive or negative, may be the person that's coming to visit you in the nursing home, or they may be the person that you may need to come live with. They may be the person that has to take care of your finances at some point in time in the future. And so one of the things as families, we always want to have a healthy relationship. And we want to pass on our values, those values that are important to our kids. And so having that conversation of, Daddy could have handled this in a different way. This is the thing I was frustrated about, but I love you. I care about you. You're still the apple of my eye. Continuing to show the value that's there, I think, is critically important. One of the things I tell people all the time, I look at kids, especially as a psychiatrist, and there's probably about 60% of what I do that could be mitigated by changes in parenting. If parents were able to just slightly shift what they were doing and respond to the child in a different way, many things could be changed. So the willingness to have those conversations, to reflect and identify what's going on, and then to be able to do something different about it, is key and critical.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Rogers, I have a question. If you observe that someone is probably is doing counseling over a period of time, especially where a child is concerned, and you somehow see that you don't see the result that probably you're looking for, is there ever a good time to approach the psychiatrist and say, well, I think medication probably would help, and if this is something that can happen, like, have that conversation during that time?
Absolutely. I think that, in a lot of situations, parents may not be verbal in terms of what they want or what they don't want, what they see or what they don't see. I've worked in academic centers most of my career where I've had medical students and residents and other therapists working with me. And one of the things I've talked to folks about is, I'm thinking about one particular case where the student came in and said, this mother, it just seems like really angry. She's just all over me and she's saying I'm not doing a good job. I think she just doesn't like me. And so we ended up going back in the room together. And I'm talking to the mom, and mom is frustrated. She's angry, she's upset, and she's really bothered. But once I could get her calmed down enough to be able to have a conversation, the things that she was saying were 100% accurate. And it went something like this. I've been coming here for about 6 months. You're telling me things are going to get better. The school's telling me things are going to get better. My kid's failing out of school. This isn't working. But nobody seems to be willing to do anything different in this particular situation. And I need to have something done. Now, listening to that particular mother, it became apparent after I really went back and looked at things that this is a kid who was hyperactive, was poorly focused, probably should have been on some medication, but hadn't been up to that point in time. We decided to prescribe meds. We decided to work with the school district more closely by having somebody go to some of her counseling appointments with her at school. And the situation actually got significantly better. And the thing that I pointed out to the trainee who was with me was the fact that I would much rather have that angry mother who was in front of me than the person who said nothing and let their child go downhill. So I think that yes, if a child is in therapy, especially if there's something that you feel like the child needs, I would absolutely speak up. And if necessary, I might even switch and have to go to a different person who may be able to hear me differently if that particular person wasn't. Because every therapist is not made equally. Every psychiatrist is not made equally. We connect with very different populations in different ways. And so, yes, absolutely. Being verbal, bringing things up, making sure that the child is getting what they need to get is critical.
Hey, Dr. Rogers, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I just had a question about, even as we consider the possibility or the necessity of therapy, are there things that those of us who may not be familiar with various modalities of how certain people practice from a faith-based perspective that we can kind of take into the situation and be able to kind of provide a filter? Because I think sometimes people in Christian communities are more skeptical of therapy because we feel like, it's based on some ideology that we feel is going to undermine our faith or push us in a direction that we see counter to the word of God. So are there different pieces of advice you can give us to say, hey, to go into these situations if you feel moved to go to therapy, to kind of keep your antennas up in a way?
That's an excellent point. So like I said, every therapist is not made the same. I always encourage people to interview folks that they are going to see. And even if they can't talk to the therapist themselves, are you able to talk to a receptionist? Are you able to look at a website that really talks about how they practice? Most people that are going to be more faith-based are probably going to kind of put that out there on their social media. They're probably going to put it on their business cards. They're going to be a lot more probably verbal about the idea of faith than somebody who's not. That being said, I would look for referrals from people who may have seen therapists in the past. So as you're looking, you may want to, ask around, has somebody seen therapist X, Y, and Z? That can get to be tricky because sometimes you may not want somebody to know you're looking for a therapist, but that can often become helpful. The other place is with your, family doctor, primary care doctor you're seeing. Frequently they'll know folks in the area and how people practice and what their areas of specialty are. And then finally, calling an office and saying, I'm a person of faith, is provider X that I'm thinking about coming to see, somebody who feels comfortable with that. And that, just asking that simple question up front can answer a lot of the questions that you would actually struggle with trying to get answered. Because sometimes it will be a flat out no, they don't do anything related to faith. Sometimes you may get an answer of yes, absolutely, that's something that we pride ourselves on doing well.
So thank you, Dr. Rogers.
I'm Dr. Rogers. Good evening. Thank you for your presentation thus far. Quick question here. When is it advisable to look into trying to understand triggers? For example, different persons from different backgrounds, you may have undergone trauma, or let's say you have battling certain experiences or certain things, and somehow underlying issues sometimes cause those triggers to go, either way, whether you express from, mild to moderate to more extreme cases. My question really is, how can one identify triggers, and what mechanisms can you, implement to, identify those triggers and deal with them proactively, as it were, so it doesn't escalate,
Excellent question. I think that all of us should try to understand our triggers, because if we can understand what's triggering us and what's driving our behaviors and what we're doing, it allows us to have a more calculated response to how we deal with things and how we do things. So the question becomes, kind of with that answer, is how do we begin to identify our triggers? The first one is, I think, just thinking about the things that we read. I think reading can do a lot to help us understand things. One of the things I encourage people to do is, oftentimes I start with a personality inventory. And there are a lot of personality inventories that you can do online. One is called the DISC, the DISC. The DISC is, you can do a quick, thing to tell you whether you're a D, I, S, or C pretty quickly. I also use one that's called the Enneagram, ENNEAGRAM. There are a number of subtypes with the Enneagram, and there are a number of books that go along with it. The thing I love about the Enneagram is it gives you a personal development kind of system along with it once you figure out your type and subtype that's there. So those are two places that I generally start working with people, especially if I'm working with couples, because oftentimes what you'll find is that the two spouses may be two different personality types, and as a result, they handle issues totally different from each other. And in fact, they don't understand why the other person is handling things the way that they are. And so I think that personality inventories, again, I like the DISC a lot. I like the Enneagram a lot. And the Enneagram has a number of books that go along with it. Would be one of the places that I would start.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Just staying right there for a minute. I don't know if it was some of the stuff that you just mentioned is a part of this, but this is just a basic question. Is what is the biggest reason couples seek counseling? And what is some recommended coping strategies that you would recommend?
Biggest reason couples seek counseling is they come from two different backgrounds and they think two different ways about life. People generally fight over three things. What I learned when I was training, and they're money, food, and intimacy. Money is probably the biggest one because money says a lot about what our priorities are. For example, I see oftentimes one member of the couple that's very conservative with money. My job is to save as much as I need to, because one day I'm going to retire, I might die, something might happen to you, and I want you to be well taken care of, and the kids and the family to be well taken care of. On the other hand, the other one might say, I'm living for today, and tomorrow's not promised to me. I don't know what's going to happen. I want to get everything that I can today while I can. Two very different ways of approaching life. Oftentimes come in the room, they're seeing me. Food, what kind of things do we eat? Where do we go? How do we vacation? How do we live life? How do we think about our families? Do we go have family dinner with our families every Sabbath, or do we go have dinner with our families once a month? Or do we see our families once a year? If a couple thinks differently about that, it may have an impact on how they see the world and each other. And then, of course, intimacy is the third thing. How do I feel about, relationships, hanging out, all those kind of things. So those are the three things that I find most frequently. And I think, especially as young couples, those are things that one really has to kind of tackle and think through to get to the place where you do feel comfortable with where are we as a couple, moving forward.
I had a list, and you ticked off all of them with the exception of communication.
Because communication, you're right, underlines all of those. Yeah, I did not put communication in there, but yeah, absolutely. What do you share? What do you not share? And how do you do it?
Awesome. Thank you.
One more for you, Doctor. Thank you so much. Conflict resolution. Are there specific strategies or approaches to conflict resolution? Because like you earlier pointed out, there are several things that can cause an issue, and how do you identify those strategies, or implement those things to like step-by-step process of how to actually deal with an impending conflict?
One of the strategies I like to do for communication is what I call active listening. And so with active listening, what I like to do, especially with couples, is sit them in chairs, two comfortable chairs, across from each other, facing each other. Person one starts with, this is what I'm thinking, this is what's on my heart. They can only tell you one idea. They can use a number of words, but it's only one idea. So you can't tell me, I'm mad about you not washing the dishes. I'm mad about vacation. I'm mad about the kids. I don't like your mama. I don't like your job. I want to move. I want to do. You can't do all of it one time. One thing. Because if you got one thing in front of you, you can usually resolve that. If you're trying to do multiple things, it becomes hard. So you're sitting across from each other. Person one starts off with, this is what I'm feeling at this point in time. The other person on the other side has to respond back only by saying, this is what I've heard you say. Is that accurate? The person has to say yes or no. If it's yes, we can move on. If it's no, they then get a chance to clarify what it is. And again, you go back to the same thing. Other person reflects, this is what I've heard. Is it accurate? Yes or no? And then the other person can respond. And then again, the same thing on the other side. Am I understanding this correctly? And the other person can say yes or no. That seems very time consuming on the front end. However, what it does is it makes you listen to what the other person is saying. And frequently, we spend our lives not listening to other people, but as folks are talking, we're trying to decide, what am I going to say to refute what they're saying? I'm not even fully hearing what they're saying. I'm just trying to figure out what my response is going to be. And so that technique allows you to really think about what the other person is saying and to make sure that you're hearing it. Because when you're triggered, you're not going to be able to hear a lot of those things. So for example, I'm going to be transparent here for a second. I've talked to my wife many times about it, so she probably will be okay. My wife comes from a fairly large Adventist family. I didn't grow up Adventist. Every Sabbath, her style in life was she felt that she had to go to her mother's house for dinner with usually about 30 people there. And that was our pattern after church every week. What that then meant in my mind is that we never really got a chance to develop our own friendships, relationships with other people in church that were not friends of her mother's. Therefore, the people that we were hanging out with were all usually 20 years older than us. So we went through this conversation for a while. Eventually, we were able to come to a spot where she could hear what I was saying, but I could also understand why it was important for her to go to her mother's house. And so our compromise was, you know what, 3 weeks a month, we will go to your mother's house for dinner. As soon as the sun goes down, we'll leave and go do our other thing. But one Sabbath, we will do things on our own, and it will be our Sabbath, and we can invite whoever we want to, or we can go wherever we want to for dinner, and we can do things that way. That conversation made such a huge difference in our relationship, and also in my relationship with my in-laws, because there was one less thing that I was angry about. I wasn't going to talk about it because as the son-in-law in the family, it's one of those things you wouldn't talk about. But at least I was able to, with her, figure some of this out and come to a place where everybody was happy. And so I think having those conversations becomes critically important. But I like the technique of just sitting there and going back and forth with very concrete, this is what I'm trying to figure out.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Dr. Rogers, how do you deal with a situation where one spouse is always shut out, and no matter how they try to communicate, their feelings and their thoughts across. They get shut out all the time. Like, their opinions actually don't, to some extent, doesn't matter in the relationship. How do you deal with that?
Tell me a little more what you mean. So that would mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, that one spouse is ignoring the other spouse?
Pretty much like, you're not seen as a, for a lack of a better word, like an equal, like your opinions or your suggestions or things that you want to, contributions to, to make this marriage or this family better is relegated to the background. For, let's say, for example, it's a man, I'm the man, and so what I say is the final. I make the decisions concerning how we spend our money, how we do this, what plans we have, for the future. My contributions, my suggestions to it as a woman is completely irrelevant. How does a woman like that, manage that situation?
Benji, you want to really throw the hard questions out there, didn't you? I think that's one where you really need an outside person to help you work through it. Whether the outside person is another couple that you trust, or whether the outside person is a therapist that you're working with to get there. Because I think that gets to a number of different issues. One's cultural. So what's the culture that each of those folks are coming from? How do those cultures view male female equality? I think it gets to a scriptural view of the world. How do people interpret the scriptures around the man being in control, having a help meet, and those kind of things? Is it interpreted in a really conservative, I'm in control, therefore you do what I say? Or is it one that's what I see as a much more biblical interpretation of I'm responsible for things, but we are a team and we have to get this stuff figured out. But in situations like that, where there really are two diametrically opposed worldviews, you're probably going to need somebody outside, probably a therapist, to help you work through it.
Thank you.
Another thing.
To ask one more question. One more question. You have time for one more question, please.
Okay, this is one. In communication. In communication, there's two ways. Like I think you alluded to some of it when you set the two couples face to face, and they said, "I heard what you said," or whatever, something like that you said. Mm-hmm. But anyway, when people are talking, when someone say, "I hear you," I hear you, I hear you, and I'm listening. Those are two different things. And so through communication, if a person is not hearing you, listening to you will be the issue. Because when somebody say, I hear you, that doesn't mean they're listening and processing it in a way where they're going to be empathetic or looking to help in that situation. Because when you look up the word hearing versus listening, they are two different things.
Absolutely. And I think every couple is different. And I think that the way couples communicate is going to also differ a little bit as well. For example, there are some couples you find that are very cuddly. They're always together. They're like Mutt and Jeff. When you see one, you see the other. My kids joke that my wife and I are that way. They're like, I just tell one of you and I figure the other person's going to know it, so I don't need to call both of you. On the other hand, I've got my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, who functions in a very, very different way. They have a great relationship. We got married about 6 months apart, but they're very individualistic kind of people in their approach to their marriage. And so each person kind of has their own thing going on, but then there's the times when they come together and these are kind of our things and where it kind of overlaps. And that style has been very successful for them. And so part of I'm listening versus I'm hearing may mean different things to different people, depending on context, depending on background, and depending on what they're used to. But the biggest thing for me is how can we make sure that the person on the other side of this conversation, whether it's my spouse, whether it's my child, is getting what I mean from my heart and not necessarily what they're hearing. And sometimes it may mean that I have to speak things in a way that they can hear it versus how I think I should actually say it, necessarily what they're hearing. And sometimes it may mean that I have to speak things in a way that they can hear it versus how I think. But thank you so much for allowing me to join today. I've really been blessed by the conversation. Thank you so much for the thoughtful, insightful questions that you've had. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers.